We are in week number 2 of this new sermon series that is just simply titled The Gospel. Just to recap a little bit, if you were able to tune in with us live last week or to watch the video last week, I opened with a main illustration that's going to serve as kind of like the illustration for this series throughout. If you remember, I talked about the gospel being like a giant diamond. The gospel is like a giant diamond for a couple different reasons. One, you imagine a giant diamond is priceless in its value. And the more that we spend time learning what the gospel truly is and its significance and its implications for our life, you're gonna find out that it is utterly priceless. Like literally, there's no amount of money that you could pay for what the gospel offers to you and to me. No amount of money. It is the most precious, most prized thing in the whole entire universe, and I'm not exaggerating. So the gospel is like a big diamond in the sense of its worth. But secondly, the gospel is like a giant diamond, and I'm not like a raw diamond, I'm thinking of like a nicely cut diamond with different edges are all around, that when you move, you can admire a giant diamond like this multiple different ways just by turning it in the light. You could look at it from one angle one way, turn it, look at it another way, and the more that you turn it, you can see the reflection of light in many, many different facets and angles, and that's what the gospel's like. This gospel that we're going to spend time learning in the weeks to come, every week we're going to look at it at a different angle and be amazed and grow in our depth of our knowledge and understanding and our appreciation of what the gospel is. So it's priceless, and it can be viewed from many different angles. In last week's message, we looked at the gospel from one particular angle, answering a couple of different questions. We answered the question like, why do we need to know what the gospel is? Well, just briefly, really quickly, we saw that we need to know what the gospel is as Christians. If you're a Christian, you need to know, because Jesus tells you and me to tell everyone else the gospel. So we got to know what it is so that we can obey Jesus and tell people the gospel. We also need to know, because the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that the gospel is the power to save people. Whatever that means, we need to know, and we're going to know that in weeks to come, what it means to be saved. But we need to know what the gospel is, because it actually saves us and other people. So we better know what it means. So we looked at that question, why we need to know what the gospel is. We actually looked at what the gospel is. The bare bones, the basics of the gospel simply means, the word gospel means good news. We saw that last week. And it's good news about something that took place in human history. The gospel is the good news of the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. That's what the news is, and that's what we're supposed to tell, and that's what saves. And we saw last week that there's actually many, many, many reasons, good, solid, logical reasons to believe in both the death and in the resurrection of this man named Jesus. So that was all last week in that one particular angle. Now we're going to rotate the gospel a little bit and look at it from a very different but particular angle as well. In this week's message, I want to answer another question about the gospel. And to set the stage for this question, I want you to imagine something with me. I can't see you, so this is okay. If you want to do this, close your eyes and imagine with me. I want you to imagine the scene that plays out in your mind's eye when you hear the description of the gospel that we read last week in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I want you just to picture it briefly. I gave you some details of it last week, but I'm going to read 3 verses from 1 Corinthians 15, and I want you to imagine it with me. Imagine the scene and imagine the picture. And so here's the verses. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Now here, begin to imagine this, that Christ died for our sins. You picture this Christ hanging on the cross, paying for our sins. He died in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures. That he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. And as you're picturing this, I just want you to picture this one that's called the Christ hanging on the cross, and this one who's called the Christ rising from the dead and appearing to people. And you have in your mind's eye a picture of a person. Because I want it to get real for you, and I want you to picture it, because here's the question that I want to ask and answer tonight. Who is this main character in the gospel? Who is this one who not only died on a Roman cross, but who also rose from the dead? Who is this Jesus? That's our question for this message this week. Who is Jesus? This is a huge question to answer in a single message. Ginormous. But we're going to give it a go. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to do my best to answer this question of who is Jesus, in 3 progressive steps. Okay? First step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with giving you a really basic statement as an answer to our question, and I'll give you some additional commentary, but I'm going to give you a working statement that's going to serve as the foundation for this answer. Then, on top of that, I'm going to add an extra level of information to that same statement with an extra level of commentary to go with it. And then thirdly, finally, I'm going to add another level of information to our statement with some additional commentary. Okay? Now, by the end of our time in this message, you will be given one complete, simple, comprehensive answer to the question, who is Jesus? So, first thing we got to do when we're talking about Jesus is know this. He's a human being. Jesus is a human being. Now, there's almost nobody today who denies this fact about him. He was an actual figure in world history. Regardless of what you may personally think of him, Jesus is arguably the most influential person who has ever lived. How many other people do you know who have the entire course of human history hinge on their existence in this world? I know it's changed since I was in high school, but when I was growing up, I learned about BC and AD in terms of knowing and dating events that have happened throughout the annals of human history. And all of human history is either documented as happening before Jesus came onto the scene or after Jesus came onto the scene. That alone is enough to make you just wonder, who is this man? Now, when we talk about the humanity of Jesus, I'm going to go through this step relatively quick. I just want to give you 10 things that we know about him. 10 things that establish and reinforce the nature of his humanity in our minds. Number 1, really quick. Jesus had a human mother. We know that from the scriptures. Number 2, Jesus had normal prenatal development that is documented that he spent his 9 months in his mother's womb. Very human. Jesus had a human childhood. Number 4 reason, Jesus grew up physically and learned things as any other child did or would. 5, Jesus had a human adulthood. And in the course of his adulthood, we see things that Jesus got hungry. He had physical hunger. Jesus got thirsty at times like any other regular, normal human being would. Jesus was tempted by the devil to sin. Jesus got wary of the crowd. He got tired at times. Jesus cried over a friend's death. These are all human elements that Jesus experienced. Number 6, Jesus had human relatives, including a legal father, an actual mother, and brothers and sisters. This is human Jesus. Jesus had a human occupation as a carpenter. Jesus, number 8, had human friends, such as we know some of their names, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Jesus, number 9, had human emotions, including anger and weeping. Jesus, number 10, he suffered a human death. So just really quickly, as we just do a cursory overview of Jesus' humanity, we can see things, and it's very important to know that he was a human being. So whatever you think about Jesus, you can know this. He's a human being, not a phantom, not a ghost, not a figment of someone's imagination, a human being. Now that serves for us as the foundation to our answer to the question, who is Jesus? Jesus is a human being. But now, what I want to do is I want to move on to adding our next piece of information to the statement. Because not only is he a human being, but, second layer of information, Jesus is a perfect, or what the Bible would call a sinless human being. Jesus is a morally perfect person. That is an incredible claim. Now, what I'm going to share with you is testimonies from 3 different groups of people that would shed light on this as being a reality. 3 different groups of people that would affirm Jesus being unique in this way compared to any other human being that's come before him or any other human being since Jesus. The only one morally perfect. This number 1 group of people that would say this: Jesus' disciples, they believed that he was a morally perfect person. Now, this is really important that it's coming from his disciples. And here's why. Because we know that for the period of roughly 3 years, that they spent 24/7, 365 with Jesus. They saw him not just in the public appearances that he made when he do all his preaching and teaching and his traveling, but they'd be with him when he wasn't in the limelight. They'd be with him in his downtime. They'd be with him in his comings and his goings, always at his hip. Because here's the thing that I know about me, and I probably know about you. If someone were to examine your life just based on the best moments of your life, maybe just based on what people saw through social media and the filtered aspects of your life and the select best moments of your life, someone may be able to come away saying like, oh man, that guy or that gal, spotless. They're pretty legit, pretty moral. I don't see anything unbecoming of them. But if you ever want to know the real person behind the filtered images on social media and the videos and all these things, here's all you need to do is you just need to ask the people that are closest to that individual. Ask their best friends, ask their family, ask their kids or their spouse if they have them. Ask, because spouses and kids and best friends, they see you and they see me not just in our great moments, they see us in the worst. And though they love us, our family, they'd be quick to say, oh, there's plenty wrong with this person. Let me just this, and not in a malicious way, just in a real way, because guess what? None of us are morally perfect. And it doesn't take a long time to hang around either one of us to realize that. But what I'm going to show you some of the things that the disciples of Jesus said about him. They were with him all the time. First-hand experiences. If he was ever going to do something that made them question, they would be able to say, yeah, he was a pretty good dude most of the time, but there's a couple of times when he got really hangry that he would say this or do this, and that would be it. But they don't say that. Listen to what they say. And again, keep in mind, based on last week, they don't have any motive to make up these things about Jesus. It didn't serve them well to just create this story. Listen to what they said. The author of Hebrews says this. Hebrews is a book in the Bible in the New Testament in chapter 4. The author says this. It says, for we do not have a high priest, speaking of Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. First statement. This author of the book of the Bible, one of the disciples, this Jesus was without sin. The Apostle Peter, one of Jesus' 12, said the same thing. Says this in the letter, one of the letters that Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 2, says, Jesus committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. And also from the pen of the Apostle Paul, we read this in 2 Corinthians 5:21. For our sake he made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. See, the disciples of Jesus, who were eyewitnesses of his life and ministry, they testify that he was a man without sin, which means that they testify that Jesus is a morally perfect person. That's amazing. That's the one group of testimony that we get from his disciples. Here's another group. Jesus' enemies and others affirmed that he didn't do anything deserving of death. Now, it's one thing for your friends to say positive things about you, but your enemies? Okay? Now, I confess this to you up front. These quotes that you're about to hear do not necessarily claim the total sinlessness of Jesus, but I do want to give them to you to show you what his enemies thought of him. The very ones that contributed to his death. This is what they had to say about Jesus. And again, they didn't have any motive for making these things up. Judas, the infamous one, said this. I have sinned, speaking of himself, For I have betrayed innocent blood. Matthew 27:4. Pontius Pilate declared this. He said, as he tried to wash his hands of all this stuff to do with Jesus at the end of Jesus' life, he says, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person. So Pilate examined Jesus, and he told everyone, I find no reason for this. I find no guilt in him, no wrong in him. And Pilate would have released Jesus, but the pressure of the religious leaders forced his hand to hand him over to be crucified. Pilate's wife, Pontius Pilate's wife, even had a dream, and she came to Pilate after saying this, have nothing to do with that innocent man. This guy is innocent. Don't get messed up with him, Pilate. Get out of there, Matthew 27:19 says. A Roman centurion at the cross of Jesus' crucifixion declared, surely this, speaking of Jesus, was a righteous man, Luke 23:47. Even one of the thieves hanging on one of the crosses besides Jesus said this man, Jesus, has done nothing wrong. So this is incredible testimony. Those who were responsible for his death and those who had no part in his life or ministry also testified that they could find no wrong in Jesus, which is incredible. So we hear about Jesus' perfection from the disciples. We hear about it from his enemies. This third testimony comes from Jesus himself. Jesus claimed that he was without sin. In John chapter 8, there's a scene where he is having this back and forth with what the Bible calls Pharisees, these religious leaders who hated him. They hated him. And Jesus lays down the gauntlet to them when he says this to them. Which one of you convicts me of sin? Which is basically the equivalent of saying, guys, my life is an open book before you all. Who of you has found anything morally indecent or improper or wrong in my life? He's not saying this egotistically. He's just saying, guys, there's nothing sinful in me. And trust me, if there was, these guys hated Jesus so much that they would have thrown the evidence right in his face, but they were silent. Even when they're the ones that handed him over to Pilate to be crucified, they didn't have any actual eyewitnesses of anything evil Jesus did. They had to conjure up stories about Jesus and bring false witness and testimony against him to have him hand him over to be crucified. So Jesus, though, is saying, he's the one claiming, guys, look at my life, and there's nothing wrong in it. That is an incredible statement. You can't say that. I can't say that. We can't say that with a right mind. We can't say that expecting someone to say, oh, of course there's nothing wrong with you. None of us would dare say, which one of you convicts me of sin? Because everyone would say, oh yeah, there's this. But Jesus threw the gauntlet down. He invited people to look at his life and to point that out. So to wrap up this point, Jesus was not your average human being. According to his disciples, according to what he thought of himself, Jesus was sinlessly perfect. A sinlessly perfect human being. Hard to believe? Maybe. But here's the thing. That's not even the most outlandish claim that's made about the man, Jesus Christ. We see that when we add our final piece of information to our statement about Jesus, when we see this, we're going to see the most outlandish claim of all. Because not only is Jesus a perfect human being, Jesus is a perfect human being who is also God. Jesus is a perfect human being who at the very same time is also God. Now I get this, where a lot of people hear this. This is where a lot of people get off the bus, so to speak. They're like, okay, morally good, a human in history, but this God business, This is where a lot of people draw a line in the sand. Because many are ready to acknowledge Jesus as a figure in history. But many, many are not ready to acknowledge him as being God in the flesh. But again, we have reasons to believe that Jesus is God. Let me give you some of them. Now, this is going to come from Jesus' disciples. They believed he was God. And again, they didn't have any motive to make this up if this wasn't true. The disciples, they called Jesus God. They said that all the miracles that Jesus did proved that he is in fact God. The disciples said that Jesus is the creator of the entire universe, which, if you didn't know this, is actually part of God's job description. And they said that's what Jesus did and who he is, the creator of everything. They worshipped him as God, which would have been blasphemous to do if you're not actually worshiping the one true God. They believed not only was he a sinlessly, morally perfect human being, but the disciples who walked with Jesus as long as they did, they testified and they responded to Jesus in such a way that they, whether they're right or wrong, they believed that he was God. Now, which brings us to the more important testimony of them all. Jesus himself believed that he was God. This is so important because it's not enough that his disciples believed he's God. Jesus believed he's God. Can you imagine how awkward it would be if Jesus didn't think this about himself, but his disciples did? Imagine if the disciples were like, hey, Jesus, we have this great story we've been working on. But for this whole story to really get off the ground and to get some wings and take off, here's what we need you to do. We need you to do something for us, okay? We need you to be God. And we're going to worship you. And we're going to try to get other people to believe that you are God. And we're going to try to get them to worship you too. And if he wasn't binding, could you imagine Jesus being like, guys, please don't do that. That's weird. That's weird. Stop. But here's the thing. Jesus wasn't coerced. He wasn't coerced into taking on this identity as God. It's something that he initiated and was totally confident in and totally unashamed of. We're going to actually take a look at a lot of things Jesus actually said about himself. But before we look at these things, I'm going to share a well-known quote with you, really well-known, one of my all-time favorite quotes. And I want to share this with you at the forefront at the beginning of sharing Jesus' words with you about himself. Because I want this quote and this idea that it presents to us, I want it at the forefront of our minds and your minds to help us properly process the things we're going to hear Jesus say about himself. Because again, many people in the world like Jesus. They respect Jesus. They acknowledge Jesus. They call Jesus a good teacher. They call Jesus a good example to follow. But here's the thing. Based on the things that Jesus says about himself, he is not just a good teacher. He is not just a good example. Based on the things that Jesus says about himself, he is either much, way much more than a good teacher, or else he is much less. Here's this quote. It's from a man named C.S. Lewis. Again, in Christian circles, you hear this all the time, but for good reason. One of the best logical, reasonable arguments and quotes for the deity of Christ that there is, in my opinion. If you don't know who C.S. Lewis is, he's an ex-atheist scholar who converted to Christianity. And he's best known for his authoring the Chronicles of Narnia, among other literary works. Here's his quote. Okay. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And so I want to push you off the fence to one side or another in this message. On the one side, he is a crazy liar and even evil based on the things that he says if it's not true. Or on the other side of the fence, he's God. And you need to choose for yourself. And I hope that if you are watching this and you're in the middle, just content to just leave Jesus on the shelf and not to take him seriously, I pray and I pray that God uses this message to really penetrate your heart and mind and push you one way or the other. Make a choice. So let's take a look at what some of the things that Jesus did and said that shows that he believes this about himself, that he is God. First thing, Jesus let people worship him as God. Now, God is the only one who should be worshipped. There's this scene in Matthew chapter 14 where his disciples are with Jesus on a boat and a giant storm comes and Jesus is sleeping, but he wakes up and he calms the storm miraculously. And the disciples, they connect these things with Jesus and the storm and this miracle, and they worship him. Now, if Jesus was a good moral teacher, at this moment, he would demand that they would stop worshiping him as God, because that is reserved for God and God alone. But he did no such thing. He let them worship him, which right away is incredible. Secondly, Jesus forgave people's sins. There was a scene where he was healing this paralyzed man, and in his interaction with this man, he says out loud, recorded for us in Matthew chapter 9, verse 2, "Take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven." And if you know anything about sins and you know anything about God, we know that God is the only one who is able to forgive a person's sins. And here is Jesus walking in the shoes, in the footsteps of God himself, doing things that are reserved only for God to do. Blatantly, just openly, unapologetically forgave this man's sins. There's more. Jesus said that he had pre-existence. Listen to the way that Jesus spoke of himself in this prayer. Nearing the end of his life, he's praying to the Father in heaven. And he says this, "And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you," get this, "before the world existed." Recorded for us in John chapter 17, verse 5. Jesus is praying this to the Father. Glorify me. I existed with you, me and you, Father, before the universe was spoken into being. Me and you were chilling. Me and you were good. So what Jesus is saying in this prayer is that he didn't come into existence the first time that when he was conceived in Mary's womb. He is the self-existent, pre-existent, eternally existent one. That's what he's saying anyway about himself. I'll leave it to you to judge if it's true or not. But this is what Jesus is saying about himself. There's more. Jesus applied the name of God to himself. Again, in John 8, I referenced this earlier, he's having this spat, this back and forth with the religious leaders called the Pharisees, who hated him. They hated him. And at the end of this dialogue back and forth with the Pharisees, Jesus said this to them, John 8:58. "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Now, if you didn't grow up in the church, you might not realize how significant that is. But what Jesus is doing is taking a name that God of heaven and earth used for himself in the Old Testament, back in the book of Exodus when he appeared to Moses in the burning bush. God revealed to himself as his name. I am. Profound, powerful name. Not bad grammar. What I am means is that I never was, and I'm never going to be. Whatever I am that always, eternally, perfectly present tense. I'm the unchanging, holy, perfect God. And God used that of himself, revealing himself to Moses in the Old Testament. And every Jew knew this name of God, this name called I am. And in his dialogue and his debate with the Pharisees, Jesus just slaps that name on himself. And we know that the Pharisees knew what Jesus was saying because they picked up stones to try to kill him for blasphemy. In their minds, a mere man equating himself with God. But that's what Jesus did. Didn't bat an eye doing it. Other things Jesus said. Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 30, he said that he is one with God, one with the Father. He says, I and my Father are one. We are one essence, one being. He goes on to say this. Jesus says that if you've seen him, now none of us have seen him physically, but back then his disciples did. If you've seen him, you've seen God. Now, the end of Jesus' ministry, before he's going to the cross, one of his disciples named Philip comes up to Jesus and asks him this maybe burning question in his heart. He says, Jesus, can you just show us the Father? And that would be enough for us. Just show us God. Jesus, will you show us God? And Jesus said to him, this is in John chapter 14, verse 9, and I picture Jesus saying this with a little bit of a sigh. He says this, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Listen to this. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Jesus said, you've been with me this long, and you're asking to see God? Philip, when you're looking at me, you're looking at God, is what Jesus is saying. Jesus said things like this. He said to them, John 6:35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. What kind of sane, regular, normal person would say something like that? Like, listen to what Jesus is saying. I am the bread of life. And if you come to me, I will sustain all of your longings. I'll give you contentment and satisfaction. The way that physical bread does that for a physical body, I am that for you. That's what God does. God has made us in his image, every single one of us, every human being made in the image of God, and we were made with the purpose of knowing God. And the reason that all of humanity is so dissatisfied all the time, so discontent, so spiritually thirsty and hungry, is that we are trying to be satisfied with things in this world that will never satisfy us because we're not made for things of this world. We're made for God. And Jesus is saying that he is that God who is meant to satisfy, who will and can satisfy a person's soul. Jesus said, I am the bread of life, and whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Again, if you didn't grow up in the church and you're hearing this for the first time, like we have to just call a spade a spade. This is lunacy talk if it's not true. Let's keep going. We're on a roll here. These are things that Jesus is saying about himself. Jesus said that he is personally something called the resurrection and the life. And that if you believe in him, you'll never die. Quoting from John chapter 11, verse 25 to 26, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. I'm just laughing because like a human is saying these words out loud. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? He asks her. And those words ring true for us today. Do you believe him? But he's saying this about himself. He goes on later in John chapter 14, verse 6, one of my favorite verses. Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, I am the life. I'm a person, and I am the way, the truth, the life, and no one comes to God the Father except through me. A human being is saying that. And this is why people get so their knickers in the twist when Christians are so exclusive about the claims of Christianity, saying that it's the only way to God. But we're not putting things in Jesus' mouth. Jesus is just saying this, like I am God, and if you want to come to God, you have to come to me. Again, just crazy talk if he's just merely a man. But if he's God in the flesh, then this makes perfect sense. Jesus said this about himself, that he has the authority to raise himself from the dead. He said this. He says, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I, he says of himself, have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. John 10:18. Jesus is saying that, yeah, I'm going to die, but guess how far my authority extends to? I'm going to raise myself up. I can do it. Do you know anyone that can say that and mean it and not be totally insane? Claiming to have the authority to not just raise other people from the dead, but the authority to raise himself from the dead. And wrapping up these things that Jesus says this about himself 3 times to his disciples on his way to his own crucifixion. He told them in detail 3 separate occasions that he was going to Jerusalem, that he was going to be crucified, that he was going to be buried, and on the 3rd day he's going to rise again. That's what he said was going to happen. He spoke the gospel before the events of the gospel ever took place, which is not a noble thing to say if you're not actually going to do it. It's not noble to say, I'm going to get crucified, killed, buried, and come alive if you're not going to do those things. So either Jesus did what he said he was going to do, or he didn't do what he said he was going to do, but there's no middle ground. You don't halfway fulfill your own self-prophecy. If he did it, you can know that he is God, because only God can do something like that. And if in fact Jesus was raised from the dead like he said he would be, then you can also believe anything else that he has to say, especially the things that he has to say about himself. But if he didn't do it, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead like he said he was going to do, here's the thing. There's nothing good and noble about that. There's nothing moral about that. He'd be a liar. He'd be a liar if he said he was going to rise from the dead and then he didn't. And here's the thing about liars. You shouldn't listen to them. You shouldn't worship them, and you shouldn't follow them, and you shouldn't listen to anything else that they have to say about themselves if they're going to be proven liars. Some of you might be hearing some of these claims that Jesus makes about himself. You might be hearing these for the first time. Some of you may be hearing these, you've heard these many times before. And I pray that this is bringing to remembrance these things and solidifying these things in your heart and your mind about who Jesus is and what he claims about himself. But I just want us to put all these things together now. And now when we do that, you have a man you have Jesus, a human being who totally believed he is God. And there's no middle ground in this discussion because of the content of the kinds of things that Jesus said about himself. Either he is God or he isn't. And if he isn't God, he's a liar or insane or evil based on the kinds of things that he said. But if he is God, then people need to figure out how they're going to respond to him. What do you do? What do you do with Jesus once you realize that he's not like you and me, that he's other, that he's totally different? He's human like us. But he's totally other because none of us are both human beings and the one true God at the same time. So this is the answer to our main question for this message. Who is Jesus? Answer: Jesus is a perfect human being who is also God. He claimed it. He proved it by his resurrection from the dead. And if you didn't listen to the first installment in this series, go back and listen to that message. See the reasons that we have to believe that Jesus actually rose. Because this is what makes the events of the gospel that we looked at last week so incredible, so priceless. That it's God himself who came down and became a man. And it was God who died on a cross, only to be resurrected from the dead on the 3rd day. That's what Jesus did. That's what God did. But why? Why would God do such a thing? That's what we're going to take a look at next week. So come back and tune in. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for this time and this opportunity again to gather virtually, just to hear the proclamation of what you call the gospel, the good news. And Lord, we are taking our sweet time with this. We're building precept upon precept, layer upon layer throughout these weeks to come. But I pray, Lord, that this group of messages goes forth, and even because it's online around the world and does not come back void. I pray that it will engage people where they're at, sitting in their homes or on their devices, listening to these things, listening to the Word of God. And I pray that it would penetrate to the deepest parts of their heart and mind, and it would stir in them something. It would do something in them. It would cause them to wrestle and to question what they understand and know about life and about reality and what they know about you and who you are and who they are in light of you, God. But I pray, Lord, that you would do miracles in people's lives through the simple, foolish proclamation of this thing that you call the gospel. Oh, Lord, take it, spread it, you bless people with it, change people with it. And I pray that you'd give people an insatiable appetite to come back, to keep hearing more and more and more. I thank you, God, for your goodness. Thank you for everyone who's tuned in to listen. Bless them where they're at. Lord, bless them where they're at. Whatever that looks like in their lives individually, bless them, I pray. And I ask all these things, Lord, in Jesus' sweet and most powerful and precious name. Amen. Awesome, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and hope you're able to tune in next week as well. Bless you.